My Emperor, if we position the troops here by the river, we control the pass. No, that leaves the flank exposed. We must hold the high ground here.
They came to Africa believing victory was already theirs. An army from Europe marched into Ethiopia with modern weapons, trained soldiers, and a plan to build an empire. They expected Ethiopia to surrender. But they had made one enormous mistake. They had underestimated the man waiting for them. His name was Menelik II. He was not simply an African king defending his throne. He was preparing an entire nation for a war that could decide whether Ethiopia would remain independent or become another colony. Menelik gathered warriors from across the country. Weapons were collected. Armies were mobilized. Supplies were moved across mountains and valleys. And while Europe watched Ethiopia as if it were already conquered, Menelik was preparing something they did not expect: a counterattack. Then, in 1896, the two armies finally met near Adwa. What happened next would shock Europe. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers descended upon the Italian forces, turning the battlefield into chaos. By the end of the battle, Italy had suffered a devastating defeat. But this was more than one African victory over one European army. It became a symbol that Africa could resist European conquest. A symbol that an African kingdom could defeat a European power on the battlefield. And behind that victory was a king who understood something his enemies did not. If Ethiopia was going to survive, Menelik II would have to make sure his enemy never got the chance to conquer it. This is the story of how Menelik II prepared Ethiopia for war, confronted an expanding European empire, and led his country into one of the most remarkable victories in African history. Part 1. The king who saw the threat coming. Long before the guns fired at Adwa, Menelik II understood that Ethiopia was entering a dangerous new age. Europe was changing rapidly. Across Africa, European powers were expanding their territories, drawing borders, occupying ports, and sending armies deeper into the continent. Britain was building an enormous empire. France was pushing across West and Central Africa. Belgium was expanding its influence in the Congo. And Italy, a relatively young European state, was desperately searching for its own colonial empire. Italy had already established a foothold along the Red Sea. Now its attention was turning toward Ethiopia. But Ethiopia was different. For centuries, the Ethiopian highlands had protected powerful kingdoms from outside invaders. Ethiopia had its own political traditions, its own Christian heritage, its own armies, and a long history of defending its independence. But Menelik knew history alone would not protect his country. The weapons of war were changing. European armies were arriving in Africa with rifles, artillery, organized supply systems, and new military technology. If Ethiopia wanted to survive, it needed more than courage. It needed preparation. Menelik had been born Sala Miriam in 1844 and belonged to the royal family of Shua, one of the most powerful regions in Ethiopia. His childhood was shaped by political struggles and warfare. As a young man, he learned that power was not simply about winning battles. It was about knowing when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to wait. Eventually, Menelik became ruler of Shua. And from there his ambitions grew. He wanted to unite territories that were divided among rival rulers and expand the authority of the Ethiopian state. But expansion brought conflict. Menelik fought campaigns to bring new territories under his control. Some submitted, others resisted. And with every campaign, his kingdom became larger. More territory meant more people. More people meant more soldiers. And more soldiers meant that Menelik was building something far more powerful than the kingdom he had inherited. He was building a state capable of confronting an outside empire. But there was another part of his strategy that would become crucial: weapons. Menelik understood that Ethiopian warriors could be brave, disciplined, and experienced, but bravery alone could not defeat modern European firepower. So he looked beyond Ethiopia. He established relationships with foreign powers and sought modern weapons. Rifles began arriving in Ethiopia. Ammunition followed. Military equipment entered the country through difficult trade routes. Menelik was slowly transforming the Ethiopian military. And this was happening at exactly the moment Italy was becoming more aggressive. Italy wanted Ethiopia under its influence. At first, the Italians did not necessarily believe they needed a massive invasion. They believed diplomacy could accomplish what armies might not. That belief would lead to one of the most important misunderstandings in African history. Italy and Ethiopia eventually signed the Treaty of Wuchale in 1889. On paper, the agreement appeared to establish friendship between the two countries. But there was a serious problem. The Italian and Ethiopian versions of the treaty did not mean exactly the same thing. The Italian version gave Italy a much stronger position over Ethiopia's foreign relations. Menelik rejected the interpretation that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate. Italy disagreed. And suddenly, what had looked like diplomacy began moving toward confrontation. Menelik now faced a choice: accept Italian influence or resist. He chose resistance. But Menelik knew that simply declaring defiance was not enough. If Italy came with an army, Ethiopia would need an army of its own. So the king began preparing. Messages traveled across the Ethiopian highlands. Regional rulers were called upon to support the crown. Warriors were mobilized. Weapons were gathered. Food and supplies had to be organized. Thousands of men would eventually answer Menelik's call. And as the Italian military presence in the region grew, the Ethiopian army was becoming something Italy had not fully anticipated: a massive national force. Menelik was no longer simply defending his personal throne. He was preparing Ethiopia for a war over its independence. And then came the moment when diplomacy finally collapsed. Italy decided to force the issue. An Italian army marched deeper into Ethiopian territory. The Italians believed their modern weapons and military organization would give them an overwhelming advantage. But waiting ahead was an army far larger than they expected. And its commander was a king who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The road to Adwa had begun, and neither side yet understood how bloody the final confrontation would become. Part 2: The Road to War. By the early 1890s, the argument between Ethiopia and Italy was no longer something that could be solved with polite words. Italy wanted influence over Ethiopia. Menelik wanted something far more important: independence. The disagreement over the Treaty of Wuchale had created a dangerous situation. Italy claimed that Ethiopia had accepted Italian control over its foreign affairs. Menelik rejected that claim completely. He understood what was at stake. If he accepted the Italian interpretation, Ethiopia could slowly lose control of its own future. First would come foreign influence, then political pressure, then military occupation. Menelik had watched what was happening across Africa. European powers were taking territory piece by piece. African kingdoms that had once been independent were being forced into treaties, defeated in battles, or absorbed into colonial empires. Menelik did not want Ethiopia to become another name on that list. So he prepared for war. In September 1895, Menelik issued a call to arms. The message spread across Ethiopia. Rulers gathered their forces. Warriors left their villages. Farmers became soldiers. Thousands began moving toward the king's army. And this was not a small force. Menelik's army grew into one of the largest African armies assembled to resist European conquest during this period. But having thousands of soldiers created another problem. An army needs food. It needs ammunition. It needs water. It needs horses. It needs communication. It needs commanders who can keep thousands of men moving in the same direction. The Ethiopian campaign was taking place across difficult terrain. Mountains, valleys, rough roads, and long distances could destroy an army before it even reached the battlefield. Menelik understood this. His forces did not simply march toward the Italians blindly. They moved through territory they knew. They used the landscape to their advantage. Meanwhile, the Italian army was moving deeper into Ethiopia. At the head of the Italian forces was General Oreste Baratieri. He commanded thousands of troops and believed his army had important advantages. The Italians possessed modern rifles and artillery. They had trained soldiers. They had military experience from their campaigns in the region, and they believed the Ethiopians were too divided and too poorly equipped to stop them. But the Italians were about to discover a major problem. They did not fully understand the scale of the Ethiopian response. Menelik had succeeded in bringing together forces from different parts of the country. Regional leaders who had their own ambitions were now contributing soldiers to a larger national struggle. Among the most important commanders were figures such as Ras Makoan, Ras Alyala, Ras Mengesha, and Empress Teta. Teta was not simply watching the war from the royal camp. She was deeply involved in political and strategic discussions. She understood the danger Italy posed, and she strongly opposed surrendering Ethiopia's independence. The Ethiopian army continued moving toward the Italian positions. The closer the two sides came, the more dangerous the situation became. Italian forces eventually occupied positions around Adwa. The landscape looked peaceful. Mountains stretched across the horizon. Valleys separated the hills. But somewhere beyond those mountains was a massive Ethiopian army. The Italian commanders knew Menelik was nearby. What they did not know was exactly how large his force had become. Then came a crucial moment. Instead of launching an immediate attack, both sides waited. Menelik had the advantage of numbers. The Italians had the advantage of modern military equipment. But neither advantage alone guaranteed victory. Everything would depend on leadership. Everything would depend on communication. And everything would depend on who made the first major mistake. During the night of February 29, 1896, the Italian army began moving. General Baratieri had decided to attack the Ethiopian forces before they could overwhelm his position. His plan depended on coordination. Several Italian brigades would move through the darkness, separate across the rugged terrain, and attack Ethiopian positions from different directions. On paper, it looked like a strong plan. But the Ethiopian mountains were not an easy battlefield. The darkness made movement difficult. The terrain was confusing. Units became separated. Communication between commanders became harder. And slowly, the Italian army began losing the coordination that its plan depended upon. As dawn approached on March 1, 1896, something unexpected happened. Instead of finding a confused Ethiopian force that could be defeated one section at a time, the Italian soldiers began encountering Ethiopian troops in overwhelming numbers. Thousands upon thousands of Ethiopian warriors were moving across the mountains. The battlefield was coming alive. Trumpets sounded. War drums echoed through the valleys. Rifles began firing. And suddenly, the Italian army realized that this was not going to be the easy victory it had expected. The battle for Adwa had begun. What happened next would turn a remote Ethiopian mountain battlefield into one of the most important symbols of African resistance in history. But Menelik still had one enormous challenge ahead of him. He had to turn his army's overwhelming numbers into an actual victory before Italian firepower could break his forces apart. The next few hours would decide everything. Part 3. The Battle That Changed Everything. Just before dawn on March 1, 1896, the mountains around Adwa were silent. But that silence was deceptive. Across the rugged Ethiopian landscape, tens of thousands of soldiers were preparing for battle. The Ethiopian army had gathered in enormous numbers. Warriors carried rifles, spears, swords, and shields. Behind them were commanders who knew the terrain. And somewhere among this massive force stood Emperor Menelik II, watching the battle he had spent years preparing for finally arrive. On the other side, the Italian army was moving through the darkness. General Orest Baratieri believed his forces could surprise the Ethiopians. His plan was to divide the Italian army into several columns and attack from different directions. If everything worked perfectly, the Ethiopian forces would be caught off guard. But the mountains of Adwa were not an easy place for a complicated military operation. The darkness made navigation difficult. The terrain was rough. The Italian columns became separated from one another. Some units moved too far. Others struggled to maintain contact. The carefully planned attack was beginning to fall apart before the main battle had even started. Then the sun began to rise. And the Italians saw them. The Ethiopian army. Thousands of soldiers stretched across the mountains and valleys. The surprise was gone. The Ethiopians knew the Italians were coming. And they were ready. The first clashes erupted as Ethiopian forces attacked Italian positions. Rifle fire echoed through the mountains. Italian artillery opened fire. Smoke began rising over the battlefield. For a moment, modern Italian weapons appeared to be doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They created devastating firepower. But Menelik had prepared his army for this. Many Ethiopian soldiers were carrying modern rifles of their own. And more importantly, they had the advantage of numbers. Wave after wave of Ethiopian troops moved toward the Italian positions. The battle quickly became chaotic. Italian units that were supposed to support one another found themselves fighting separately. Instead of facing one unified Ethiopian attack, they were suddenly surrounded by Ethiopian forces coming from multiple directions. The Italian soldiers fought desperately. But their commanders were struggling to understand what was happening around them. The mountains had become a trap. Ethiopian forces controlled the high ground. They knew the paths through the terrain. And their numbers allowed them to keep pressure on the Italian positions. Menelik's army was not simply charging forward without a plan. Different Ethiopian commanders were directing forces across the battlefield. Ras Makoan led important forces during the battle. Ras Alyala, one of Ethiopia's most experienced military commanders, also played a major role in the campaign. Empress Tedu had earlier urged resistance against Italy and remained an important figure within the Ethiopian leadership. The Ethiopian attack continued. Italian positions began collapsing one after another. Some units attempted to retreat. But retreating through unfamiliar mountain terrain while being pursued by a much larger enemy turned the withdrawal into another disaster. The battlefield became filled with confusion. Soldiers were trying to find their commanders. Units became mixed together. A retreat that might have saved part of the army was becoming increasingly difficult. And then came the moment that changed the battle completely. The Ethiopian forces had gained the upper hand. The Italian army was no longer attacking. It was fighting for survival. Menelik's army pressed forward from multiple directions. The Italian positions were breaking apart. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The remaining Italian forces began retreating toward Eritrea. But the retreat was not a clean withdrawal. It was a defeat, a devastating one. When the fighting finally ended, the scale of the Italian disaster became clear. The Ethiopian army had defeated a European colonial force on the battlefield. Italy had expected to expand its empire. Instead, it had suffered one of the most humiliating military defeats in its colonial history. And the consequences reached far beyond the mountains of Adwa. News of the Ethiopian victory spread across Africa and beyond. At a time when European powers were dividing much of the African continent among themselves, Ethiopia had done something extraordinary. It had resisted, and it had won. But Menelik's victory was not simply about having more soldiers. It was the result of preparation, political organization, weapons acquisition, military leadership, knowledge of the terrain, and a willingness to fight for independence. The Italian army had arrived believing Ethiopia could be defeated. It left the battlefield carrying the memory of a completely different reality. Africa had not surrendered. Ethiopia had stood its ground. And at Adwa, Menelik II had shown the world that a European army could be defeated by an African state determined to defend its independence. But the greatest question was still waiting. What would this victory mean for Ethiopia? And why would the Battle of Adwa become much bigger than a single battle? Because the story of Adwa was only beginning. Part 4. The defeat that shocked Europe. The battlefield at Adwa had gone quiet. But the consequences of what happened there were only beginning. Italy had entered the conflict expecting to expand its influence in Ethiopia. Instead, its army had suffered a devastating defeat. For Europe, the news was shocking. European powers were accustomed to seeing African kingdoms defeated by armies equipped with modern weapons and organized military systems. But Ethiopia had broken that pattern. An independent African state had defeated a European colonial army in a major conventional battle. And suddenly, Adwa was no longer just an Ethiopian victory. It had become a message. Africa could resist. The defeat forced Italy to reconsider its position. Only months after the battle, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa in October 1896. The disputed Treaty of Wuchale was effectively cancelled, and Italy recognized Ethiopia's independence. Menelik had achieved what he had been fighting for. Ethiopia would not become an Italian colony. But there was something else happening. News of Adwa traveled far beyond Ethiopia. Across Africa, people heard that an African army had defeated a European power. For Africans living under colonial rule or facing European expansion, the victory became a powerful symbol of resistance and pride. Later generations would remember Adwa as proof that European conquest was not inevitable. But Menelik's victory had not happened by accident. He had spent years building his position. He expanded his territory. He brought rival forces together. He secured modern weapons. He strengthened his government. And when the crisis with Italy became unavoidable, he was able to mobilize a huge army. That preparation mattered. So did the Ethiopian commanders who fought alongside him. Menelik was the emperor, but Adwa was not the achievement of one man alone. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers fought and died. Regional leaders brought their armies. Women supported the campaign and helped maintain the massive military force. Empress Teta played an important political role and became one of the most remembered figures associated with Ethiopia's resistance. The victory therefore belonged to an entire society that had mobilized to defend its independence. But victory also came with a terrible cost. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded. Families lost husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. The battlefield had created a national victory, but it had also left deep scars. And Menelik now faced another challenge. Winning a war was one thing. Governing a growing empire was another. His territories had expanded dramatically during his reign. That expansion brought new peoples and regions under Ethiopian rule. It also created tensions and conflicts that would shape Ethiopia's future. So Menelik's legacy is complicated. He is remembered as the emperor who defended Ethiopia from Italian conquest. He is remembered for modernizing the state and acquiring weapons that helped protect Ethiopian independence. He is remembered for Adwa. But his reign also involved territorial expansion and harsh campaigns against some neighboring peoples. History does not always give us simple heroes and villains. Menelik II was a ruler of his time, operating in a continent being transformed by warfare, empire, diplomacy, and colonialism. Yet one fact remains impossible to ignore. In 1896, Italy came to Ethiopia believing it could impose its will. Instead, it was forced to negotiate. The European power had been defeated. The African kingdom remained independent. And the name of the battlefield became permanently connected with resistance. Adwa. For generations afterward, that name would carry a powerful meaning. It represented the moment when an invading European army discovered that Ethiopia would not simply surrender. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is what happened after the victory. Menelik did not stop thinking about the future. He understood that winning one war would not guarantee Ethiopia's survival forever. The world was changing. Industrial powers were becoming stronger. Weapons were becoming more destructive. And Africa remained under enormous pressure from European empires. Menelik knew Ethiopia needed to modernize if it wanted to remain independent. So the emperor turned his attention toward building a stronger state. Roads and communications expanded. Modern institutions began developing. Foreign relationships became increasingly important. And Ethiopia entered a new era. The victory at Adwa had protected Ethiopian independence. But Menelik now had to protect that independence through modernization, diplomacy, and political power. The war had made him famous. The victory had made Adwa legendary. But the final question remained. After defeating an invading European army, what kind of Ethiopia would Menelik II leave behind? That answer would define his legacy long after the battlefield fell silent. Part 5. The King Who Refused to Let Ethiopia Fall. The battle was over. The Italian army had been defeated. But for Menelik II, the real work was only beginning. He had protected Ethiopia from becoming an Italian colony, But he knew one victory could not guarantee the future. Europe was still expanding. European armies were becoming more powerful. Across Africa, kingdoms were falling one after another. Menelik understood that Ethiopia could not simply depend on its mountains, its warriors, or its history. It had to become stronger. So the emperor turned his attention toward modernization. Under his rule, Ethiopia began developing new forms of communication and transportation. A railway connected Addis Ababa toward the coast. Telegraph and telephone systems were introduced. Modern schools and hospitals began appearing. A new capital, Addis Ababa, grew into the political center of the country. Menelik also continued strengthening Ethiopia's international relationships. He understood that diplomacy could be just as important as military power. Because the lesson of Adwa was not simply that Ethiopia could win a battle. The deeper lesson was that independence had to be defended continuously. Menelik's reign was also complicated. His expansion brought large territories and different peoples under imperial rule. Some campaigns were brutal. Some communities resisted. And the history of Menelik's empire cannot honestly be reduced to a simple story of heroism. But when the question is why Adwa became one of the most important moments in African history, the answer is clear. It broke an assumption. The assumption that European military power would always defeat African resistance. At Adwa, that assumption was shattered. An African army had defeated a European army. An African government had forced a European power to recognize its independence. And Ethiopia remained sovereign while much of the continent was being divided among European empires. That is why the story of Menelik II still matters. Not because he was perfect. Not because the Ethiopian victories solved every problem. But because in one of the most dangerous periods in African history, Ethiopia refused to simply accept the future that European powers were trying to impose. Menelik prepared. He negotiated. He gathered an army. He secured weapons. And when diplomacy failed, he fought. On March 1, 1896, the mountains around Adwa became the stage for a battle that would be remembered for generations. The guns eventually fell silent. The soldiers returned home. The battlefield became part of history. But the meaning of Adwa continued to grow. For Ethiopians, it became a symbol of national independence. For Africans and people of African descent around the world, it became a powerful symbol of resistance. And for the European powers watching from afar, it was a warning. Africa was not simply an empty prize waiting to be claimed. There were nations. There were armies. There were leaders. And there were people willing to fight for their freedom. Menelik II would die in 1913, but his most famous victory would live far beyond his lifetime. Every generation would return to Adwa. Every generation would remember what happened when an invading army marched into Ethiopia believing victory was inevitable. They were wrong. Because Ethiopia did not surrender. It fought. And it won. So when we remember Menelik II, we should not remember only the emperor sitting on a throne. Remember the man who understood the danger coming toward his country. Remember the soldiers who crossed the mountains to defend it. Remember the commanders who led them. Remember the women who supported the campaign. And remember the battlefield where an empire's ambitions collided with a nation's determination to remain free. The Italians came expecting conquest. They left defeated. And the world was forced to see something it had underestimated. Africa could fight back. Africa could organize. Africa could win. And at Adwa, Menelik II did more than defeat an army. He defended the independence of Ethiopia and created a legacy that would echo across African history for generations. The battlefield is quiet now. But the story of Adwa never truly became silent.